Thrilled to be here, especially because the invite said bring snacks. So we know it's a good book club. And just the couple of minutes that we've had together, I mean, what a joy. So, as you mentioned, my background is in law. I went to Harvard Law School intending to be a litigator, discovered what that meant day to day, and maybe some of the mental health impacts of being an attorney. I'll let those stats sort of speak for themselves, and fell into leadership development, came across the Harvard Negotiation Project, getting to yes, difficult conversations, had this big aha moment of, wait, you can talk about things? What a novel idea, because that was not the family I grew up in. Fast forward, I got off the conveyor belt of law students to big law firms and was facilitating leadership development experiences across geographies, six continents, across all industries, helping people develop these skills around how to have difficult conversations, give and receive feedback. And notice some people still don't have the difficult conversations. Apparently, conflict avoidance is everywhere. And that even though this training out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, a lot of those tools were sound and helpful, some people disproportionately would not speak up. And the common advice, just speak up, I think doesn't cut it. You know, it has riffs of a Nike just do it. And as much as I love a good Nike Cortez shoe and think it's a brilliant marketing slogan, be more confident, have more courage, essentially go fix yourself, and then maybe we can be in relationship or work together, seems to dismiss a whole lot of reality. So to me, the missing piece to unlock all of those skills, unlock healthier relationships was silence. Are we actually talking about the thing that gets in the way of how we want to live and lead? And have we been just misdiagnosing it this whole time by saying you need to, go get yourself more courage, go get yourself more confidence? So that's how Unlearning Silence was born of, I think we've got it wrong. I think the question is not how to speak up more, better, louder, but really what role does silence play in my life and my leadership? And if we're a place here at this book club that talks about our real lives, I'm also the youngest daughter of an immigrant family from Taiwan to the United States. And maybe that explains why I wrote a book about silence. Because in that construct, boys are more important than girls. So I am less important than my older brother. As an immigrant, you have all the assimilation, acculturation, you should blend in. My dad literally said, we live in America, speak English now. And so, what do you lose? Which parts of yourself do you silence over time? Which makes you a really good entry level hire. People love to work with you when you let them take credit for your work and seem to have no needs, goals, hopes, and concerns of your own. But then hit this point where you're not leadership material. You certainly don't have executive presence. And all of the damaging aspects that I talk about in the book and that I know we'll get into in this conversation of really the piece of work that being silenced or learning silence over time does to you in terms of your own perception of self, your sense of worth, your ability to contribute effectively. So, unlearning silence was really this, we've got it wrong. Let's more accurately diagnose the situation. And it's not just the silence I need to unlearn, but the ways that we unintentionally silence each other, even when we don't intend.
Mm.
I see you flipping through a book and I saw
I'm,
facial expressions happening there. So tell us
I
what's
was,
going on.
well, I was thinking about some of what you said and how, like, I remember reading it in the book, like how, you know, part of your background and your culture has it. And I don't know, this book was really, really like a good read for me, but also like made me
Mm.
want to cry sometimes. But it's like very,
Ah.
it's just a normal book. But I've had so many experiences like that. And I think that's one of the reasons I think everyone should read this because it's so relatable.
Mm.
And I was flipping through and looking at one of the things that I really like that it said silence protects your energy.
Mhm.
Like every now and then I'm like a bubbling ball of rage and I can hold space for other people's rage.
Mm.
But then I hear like behind people's backs, people are criticizing the person who speaks up. Like it's, or they're saying women who speak up, those are just, the people that I've noticed who have spoken up, they're difficult.
Yeah.
women and men just kind of like stab you in the back.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to read like one thing that I really liked where it's like which chapter is this? It says three questions we wrestle with and like what are the costs of
Yeah.
choosing voice?
Yeah.
Um, so I was hoping you could talk about this. It says like, yeah, you've misunderstood. I'm supposed to be the one that gets to vent, not you. Like, let's talk about that. Like the roles we're picking here.
There's so many layers there. I'm nodding when you say people stab you in the back. I think all of us, and careful with my words, but I'd venture to say all of us have experienced that, whether in school or at work or in our lives. And frankly, it sucks, right? It is awful, especially when it's done by people you thought you could trust, and it really does a number of who can I trust in this world. I want to highlight not just the ugh, and that's a technical term, but also the opportunity, which
Right.
is we don't have to show up that way.
Right.
We actually can choose another way. Just because everyone else is acting that way doesn't mean we need to. And that is the problem. And one of the pitfalls is that we forget we have a choice with good reason, right? When the culture around us, our work team is backstabby and is, let me talk about you, let me say the right thing to their face, but then go and undercut them. It is, if we are not actively aware that that's happening and aware that we have a choice, the easy thing to do is to fall into those same patterns.
Right.
And if you read most leadership development books, they say, look, if you want to gain influence in a system, you should mimic the dominant behaviors, look and sound like them. Right. But if that's not who you want to be, you start to get this cognitive dissonance, this values misalignment. So I want to be really clear in our conversation that just because we see the silencing happening and have been silenced doesn't mean that that's the way that we move forward. Now, there's a whole lot that you mentioned in this is chapter 3, which is actually my favorite chapter of the book, When
Good one.
Silence Makes Sense. Because unlearning silence does not mean saying everything everywhere all the time to everyone. The world is far too noisy and complex for that. And what I call out in chapter 3 is both, yes, there are times when we stay silent and it can be strategic. The difference between silence that is oppressive or damaging and silence that is additive or strategic is agency. So that's going back to that point of, am I choosing this because I don't think that battle is worth fighting today? Or I've watched how it goes down and that's not where I want to go with it, but I am choosing for a bigger purpose or for my values alignment to spend my energy here. What we tend to get wrong in that calculation, though, is that we're, as human beings, very focused on the short term. So the short term cost of having to deal with your strong emotional reactions now, the defensiveness now, and we are not focused on the long term, which is things usually don't change if no one says anything or does anything differently. We're also focused on who incurs the cost, which is usually me, versus what happens to the group or the culture if we don't say anything. So it's really offering questions that I would argue only the one person, only you can answer for yourself. Only you know what's keeping you up at night, what demons you're carrying, what you're navigating, how much sleep you got, how much energy you have, right? There's such a binary, either you say something or you don't. You're a good person or you're a bad person versus what do I have bandwidth for today? And where am I putting my energy? And let's also be really clear in the workplace. One of the things that I talk about in the book in chapter 5 is the three buckets of we say we care about people's opinions. So it's like, tell me what you really think. I want to hear what you have to say. We have our employee engagement survey. And Janae, your face is telling us everything. So I'm loving it.
Well, I mean, we work with people who are depressed, who are like in healthcare. And let me tell you, the messages that we get are so different than those employee surveys because we're not your employer.
Yes. And also because, I mean,
No one's going to
yes,
go to their job and be like,
yes,
you're terrible. Like,
yes,
okay, well,
yes.
thanks.
Also, think about what you actually do with that information. If it's clear, You've made it clear what you're going to do with it. I was talking with a client yesterday who said they're doing focus groups about this leadership transition, but the organizing team doesn't have clarity on what they're going to do with the information from the focus groups. Are
Oh, we make
you?
it clear we'll delete it. We're gonna delete
Yeah.
this.
Thank you. Right? We don't know whether human beings can't make accurate decisions about whether to use their voice, share their perspective, offer their expertise, insights, thoughts, unless they know what's going to happen with it. And what's going to happen with it is a set of costs or outcomes or consequences that you're okay with or that you can stomach and bear.
Right,
And that's that two-piece both and of how we react, what we do with the information, how we treat people. All of that can shift someone else's decision and calculation of whether it makes sense to share.
right.
So it's not just me unlearning my silence to share my perspectives, even though that's part of my work, but also how are we showing up for each other? Because if you're vulnerable and you share something with me and I go and use it to stab you in the back, what does that tell you? It tells you that it's not trustworthy, it's not worthwhile, and the consequences, I've made it worse rather than better.
I like that you just talked about how it's so reinforced to be silent because of the repercussions, the consequences. I'm curious. So you've worked in so many different areas. So like Ivy League schools, Google, Nike, Pixar, and then the Red Cross. Do you see anything specific or unique about how healthcare has silence consequences? I'm just curious if it, it's apples to apples or if there's
Yeah.
anything kind of unique. You've got a healthcare group here, so I think that's
Yeah.
we're always fascinated by like what in the world is going on with this type of
Yeah, such a good
workplace
question.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Lots of thoughts come to mind. One is this doctor heal thyself and the appropriate eye rolls that have showed up on the screen here. That also there's such a hierarchy. And so like you take the operating room and the how nurses are treated versus an attending versus an intern, that hierarchy is so steeped with real ramifications for people professionally on the heels of tremendous educational investment.
Mhm.
So, do I push back to my attending if I'm doing an internship? Probably not because they've got a lot of power over me. And so there's a lot of work to do with that leadership of if you really want someone to say something because it's not in the patient's interest, then it's actually your responsibility as the higher power person to make it clear and make it worthwhile. Then there's also the bigger macro piece of healthcare as an industry and the pressures that is under and insurance companies. And I say this in part as a patient of when I gave birth to my son, I ended up back in the hospital a couple days later in the ER vomiting blood because I was nauseous and the medical professional offered me a drug to treat the nausea without looking at the root cause. And the pressure to operate in with pace and speed is different. I'm based in California in the heart of Silicon Valley, so there's a lot of like we iterate with speed and we go to scale. But the you've got 10 minutes or 5 minutes with this patient. That's a really different speed and pressure that I don't see in most industries, even though most industries like to say that, we're the highest pressured. And the stakes are also higher in a different way because of life and death. Um, so there's a question for me. I see silence playing out in how much deference are we giving to each other? Because a patient probably actually knows their body the best and the context the best because their healthcare professional may be with them only for that slice in time. And so it is a responsibility also to not defer because there's an MD, a PharmD, multiple Ds, but to think about how do we leverage each other's perspective. That's maybe five things that I see unique about healthcare there that I've just thrown at you. So feel free to react based on what resonates or doesn't.
I'd love to jump in and share about the physician heal thyself.
Mm.
And I am so on board with that share and that thought because I think, everything starts with the self,
Mm,
and the system does not encourage self-care.
yeah.
It's not modeled, it's not lauded, but I'm not blaming the system. I do think we decide to take responsibility for ourselves. And I
Mm,
think that work that everybody uh, could do is not done because of the
mhm.
pace, because of the hierarchy, because of the expectations. And consequently, you have people modeling behavior that is modeled to them, and
Yeah.
it just is self-perpetuating and destructive.
1000%. And I think this to me gets to fundamental definitions of voice and silence. So let me go there. Silence, I'd argue, is when there's not enough room or doesn't seem like there's enough room in the system, in the relationship for your needs, goals, hopes, and concerns. That the only way to survive or be rewarded is to comply, right? To match the behavior of those around you. Voice, I would argue, is not just the words that you say or don't say in a meeting or a conversation. Voice is how you move through the world. Now, the tricky thing about voice and silence is that silence breeds silence. This
Mhm.
is why you get what researchers call employee or organizational silence, the collective phenomenon of saying nothing. If everyone else around me is working at this pace in this way, those are the behaviors that have been rewarded. It is really hard to go against the grain. It is also really hard to remember that you could go ahead against the grain and choose a different way. Now, because I'm here to offer hopefully useful perspective, the converse is also true. Not only does silence breed silence, but voice inspires voice.
Mhm.
So one physician choosing some act of health, self-care, which could be hydration, could be movement, right? Any of the basics that we know fundamentally is an input into the system that can create a different culture. But it starts with remembering that you have a choice because there's so much pressure to conform that you're often entering a new system thinking, how do things work around here? And then how do I play that game versus what game am I playing? And what game am I playing to me goes back to the essence of voice. How do I want to live? How do I want to lead? And the flow on effect of that both being modeled and creating that ripple effect. And fundamentally, that's how you shape culture. So I love that call out, Risa.
And
I love.
I really love the idea of bringing this kind of invisible force that's out there to the forefront and starting to talk about it. That's what I loved about you writing a book about this is these are things no one talks about. These are all very um, hard to percept what's going on.
Yeah.
And I know when I have students, it's something that I try to tell them about. They're about to enter this really complex, multi-layered, multifaceted world where there's all these invisible forces at play. And it's often really difficult to define or even know what's going on until it's too late and you've been suppressed, right? Like
Yeah.
you've kind of learned almost imperceptibly to yourself that you've
Yes.
learned that silence. What advice do you have for someone that hasn't quite entered that yet? Like, for instance, like one
Mm.
of our students that we have of how do they prevent learning this? Like, how do you kind of unlearn in advance or proactively make sure you're not picking up these um honest
Yeah.
detrimental
Yeah.
pieces of workplace toxicity because not being able to speak up means that that patient might have a medical error that
Yes.
goes unaddressed or something like that.
Yeah, I love that question. Number one, start with the mindset and the assumption, the operating assumption that the system is broken. Right. I think going into it, particularly if it's something you've worked for, there can be this sheen of, oh, I've arrived and people know what they're doing. And yes, people may know what they're doing on a technical front, but we're all learning and figuring it out as we go, particularly how do I practice my craft or my expertise in this moment in time, in this environment. So I would actually temper any deference or like holding up of a system and of a way of working on a pedestal. I think that gets you a long way there, right? This is the system. It's got pros, it's got cons, it's got things that work, things that don't. But I'm not going to assume that everyone knows what they're doing and everything actually works the way it's supposed to work. And that operating assumption means that you don't then later have what I think many of us have cross industries of this, oh shoot, disorientation moment, where you have that realization. That's the place I would start. The other place I'd start is that you, as a student or someone new to the industry, coming with fresh eyes is so very powerful.
Mhm.
Because if you have been in a system for a long time, it is hard to see, it's hard to see the system accurately, right? It's a little bit, and there's an example in the book of a family whose house smells because of the cats. Like you can't smell your own house. And that's the same thing of coming into a system with fresh eyes. If you can smell and see things that people who have been entrenched and acculturated cannot. And often we discount the newer voice. Both we discount it ourselves, and sometimes we treat people of, you're new, you don't yet know the ropes, versus you're new and you have a valuable perspective that is not definitive, but that is additive. And that actually we have a more accurate data set if we layer on those different perspectives. And so if other people aren't treating you that way, to not forget that actually you, based on your life experience, your training, your own life story, you've got something to add.
I love that you said that. I think that's a really brilliant approach to just know there's such value in being new and recognizing that as a strength versus kind of the default, which is recognizing that as a weakness. But
Yeah.
I did, Charisse, I want to make sure we get a
Yeah,
chance
Tracy,
to
you
have
always
the
have good questions.
question. We need to hear.
Yeah.
I actually did. So I was thinking about like some of the things you say in the book, and I was reflecting on usually when I write these type of things, these subjects that you're writing on, it's usually because I'm unpacking something for myself. So my
Mm.
question for you is I don't want to say like the cliche is like what made you write the book, but did writing the book, was it therapeutic for you? Did it make you feel more visible? Where did this all come from for you?
Yeah.
Ooh, good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. I shared a little bit about how the book came to be. And I mean, Risa, you can comment on this as well. I would argue that as an author, any process of birthing something turns you inside out.
Mhm.
And writing a book on unlearning silence while unlearning my own silence is next level. Did it feel therapeutic? Maybe it will at some point in time. But as with many health journeys, there is still a journey and it's midstream. This really was my, I mentioned I spent years teaching concepts that are held up as like the canon of interest-based negotiation. You don't dare question getting to yes, or difficult conversations is, I think the tagline is now the definitive book on having difficult conversations. And unlearning silence is, okay, what is missing from those things? As someone
Mhm.
who has been really deeply steeped in it and watched the differential adoption of those ideas across populations, that is, apparent and non-apparent identities, gender, race, education, class, etc. So unlearning silence was really my bet on myself of, I think there's something here. I see it. I'm the more junior person. I'm not I'm not um, Bill Urey or some of these guys who are held up as the godfathers of whole industries. And at the same time, I'm convinced that we've got it wrong, that the prescription of speak up is missing a huge factor, which is silence. And
Okay,
so,
so then go ahead.
so
I love this.
Like I have a whole, this goes in so many directions for me.
also
Can we
notice
look
the
at,
meta here of voice inspires voice. So the more we talk
Yeah.
about it, the more comes out.
well, like I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday about the same thing because of some of what we're seeing in medicine with like support for students and stuff. And I have to tell you, like, because I work on the med ed side, one of my favorite publications has always been From Symptom to Diagnosis by Adam Sifu and his team. And
Mm.
I always use that particular language in that book, and I apply it to other areas like healthcare and IT and all those type of areas that I work in. I'm like, if we look from symptom to diagnosis, we could get the answer. My question has always been in medicine and particularly in medical education, if we're silencing the voices who are questioning some of these things, are we really diagnosing properly and getting to maybe what's wrong in medical education as far as the curriculum, like this, the things that I feel need to be unlearned, like about like racism and how things affect women's health and that type of thing. Are we learning those things if we're still like we're not doing symptom to diagnosis if we're silencing the voices? So my question is, in medicine, how do we get there?
I'd argue choice by choice, moment by moment, person by person. And that sounds really slow and painful. And there's totally an argument for the systemic, which is why chapter 10 of my book is Change the System, and you break it down in bite-sized pieces of policies and practices and the inconsistencies there. But it starts with realizing there is something missing.
Mhm.
And all the research and data, I mean, talk about how much money goes to women's health research and what's missing there, for example, one of many examples. Um, it it reminds me of what Megan's question, right? How do you operate in this system? And if you start with the assumption that it's broken, start with the assumption that things are missing. If you actually anchor to what most everyone says about continuous learning, then we have a chance. But
Mhm.
if we're stuck and also there's status and ego and power involved in maintaining the status quo, we don't actually get to change. We don't get to accurate diagnosis. You can't get to an accurate diagnosis if you don't have accurate data,
Right.
right? And so we're actually working with an incomplete data set.
Right.
That's the most sort of neutral way that I can put it. Because there are lots of non-neutral ways of
Yes.
putting it, right?
I love that.
So what is hard though is when we look around and no one else seems to be doing it, and the costs are so high or made to be so high of trying to ask a question or offer a different perspective, then that calculation that we talk about in chapter 3 of is it worth it? The outcome, the answer is different. So where I go is what can we each do in both articulating and naming what we see as missing, as well as how we receive one another in that system of Charisse raises it. And I'm like, that, you're right. You're right. Let's do something about it rather than Charisse, you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
It's always been like this. Yeah.
Great. Just because it's always been like this doesn't mean that that's a statement of fact. It has
Mm-hmm.
been that way. Where has it gotten? Who does it serve? It also goes back to values. And Megan, this is a little bit of your question earlier of anyone entering the system. What are your own values?
Mm-hmm.
What do you care about? Because as much as you might be an employee or a team member, a teammate, if you're not clear on what your own values are, which give you anchor and anchoring, then you're more likely to be swayed and your voice, your energy conflated with the organization's. And if the organization's values, number one, they may just be words that are up on a conference room or in some PDF that no one reads, or they don't align with your own, then where are you left? Right? Because each of our actions, our day in, our day out, that becomes our life over time. So to me, it's do I know what I stand for, how I want to live, my actions lead to that, as well as how do I receive someone else, particularly if they're saying something, doing something that is different. Different isn't inherently bad. Different is just different. And different is also at the core of any innovation that has ever happened in the world.
Right.
Can we hold that and act like that if we really care about learning, growth, innovation, making things better?
I remember, okay, I found
Yeah.
in the book where it says something about related to this,
Mm.
where it says like, what does listening being able to hear across difference look like? Listening means working to understand what the other person is trying to communicate, which may or may not be reflected in the words they initially use. I loved that. As you listen, ask yourself, what is the core of what they are trying to convey? What are they really saying or asking? And then this is the thought. I wanted to talk about a little bit more related to what you just said. Like, check your motivation and your purpose at the moment. Are you listening just to confirm your understanding of the world, or listening for the intent and heart of what the individual is trying to express? And like in the context of our conversation, I really like when we're talking about this learning systems, one of the first things we need to do is to understand our own motivation.
Mm.
So I didn't know if you have tips for that, or like, how did you come to do that? I mean, there might be some tips in the book too, everyone. So read it.
Yeah, I'm stuck on that second question of how did I come to do it? I think it starts from, and this is double loop learning, right? If you want to change results, often people look at changing actions, but actually it's our mindset that changes our mindset drives our actions. So if you really want to change behavior, you actually need to go to mindset, which drives behavior, which drives results, rather than just change the action, but not change the mindset. My operating mindset is I don't know everything. Literally, there's no way that I could know everything. And so not knowing everything isn't a point of weakness.
Mm-hmm.
It is just awareness. From that mindset, though, comes the flow on curiosity of what do I not see? And what do I need other people, resources, teammates, what do I need them to share in order for me to see the world more clearly? Now, where I've made the mistake, and I know many of us do, is diminishing the value of our own perspective because we can't see it all. And that's really easy to do when people repeatedly have diminished your perspective, right? Oh, you're new. Oh, that's just because it's the time of the month. You don't really mean that, right? Any of these things that get thrown around throughout our careers. I love your reactions that apparently I'm not the only one. And right, the things that people actually say, and then the things that they might think and not say. Um, so to not diminish my own perspective, it is what does the world look like from where I sit, right? From where I sit, this doesn't make sense. From where I sit, it doesn't add up. From where I sit owns the legitimacy and the limitation of my perspective, and inherently begs the question, what does it look like from where you sit? Which could be a different role on the team, could be a different place in the org chart, could be a different life experience, could be coming at it with fresh lenses. But the pitfall that I see people repeatedly making and that I've made is because I don't have all the answers and I'm not omnipotent, because apparently I'm not, a universal God,
So that's
then
the expectation for starting.
right, then you don't have anything valid to offer. That's false.
Mm-hmm.
You have a piece of the puzzle to offer. And if you're not offering it, then anyone who is relying on that data set is actually working on an incomplete data set.
Yeah.
I'd start with the mindset.
Okay, we're going to go offline. Everyone listening in, we love you. Sign on.
But apparently not that much.